department. We have 4 papers, 20 minutes each, and we have time for a few questions in between. The first paper is going to be presented by Aline Buetikofer from the Norwegian School of Economics. Please, Aline.
Thank you. So the paper I'll present today is called Infant Healthcare and Long-Term Outcome, and it's joint work with Kjell, who is chairing the session, and Katrine Loken, who is at the University of Bergen. The main motivation for this study originally was that we know from previous papers that early interventions matter in the long run. And there is the significant effort still to improve early child health care, both neonatally, so in the hospital, but also post-neonatal health care, what are well child visits or simple medical follow-ups by medical professionals. There are very large disparities in infant health care, both across but also within countries. And we focus on one particular neonatal policy, and these are these well child visits. So medical follow-ups by either doctors or nurses to mainly seemingly healthy babies. So kids that go and see a doctor without having necessarily a health problem. The literature so far has focused on hospital-provided care programs mostly, or on care directed to specific groups, like very lower birth weight babies, for example. And the well child visits, what we look at, are a way more basic form of care. They're much cheaper, and they're definitely relevant for a bigger population. So the main question that we look at is what are the long-term effects of these well child visits? And this is a question that is difficult to answer because there is this large socioeconomic gradient both in infant health care, or in infant health, and in access to pediatric examinations. So we need to analyze plausibly exogenous changes in access to well child visits in order to answer our question. So what do? We analyzed the rollout of mother and child health care centers in Norway, so from 1936 to 1955, and we study the impact of these access to well child visits on long-term economic outcomes. And we use for that administrative data that we link to unique historic data on the timing of the opening of these mother and child health care centers. And I can actually claim that it's unique historic data because we went to the archive and we punched it ourselves. So just to give you a sneak preview on what we find that access to these mother and child health care centers matters in the long run in terms of both education and earnings. The results are robust to a lot of different specification tests, such as mother-specific fixed effects, event study framework, and different type of municipality-specific time trends. And we also can contribute in kind of finding out what could potentially be the mechanisms behind these findings. And we find that it mainly must be nutrition within the first years of life that is contributing to this effect. So we have several measures where we can actually see that this mainly hints to nutrition as a channel. This is not a complete picture of the literature related to our project, but it's giving you an idea of the growing literature on long-term effects on policy-induced variations in early life health. And this ranges from extra medical care that you give to very low birth weight babies, first antibiotics, so in the late 1930s when sulfa drug became available, access to paid maternity leave and therefore also prolonged duration of breastfeeding for a lot of mothers, or access to food stamps or any other type of food programs in the first years of life. The importance of pediatric well child visits has not been studied that much, but it's a growing literature as well. And it mainly comes, one of the papers discussing its importance is a paper by Chen, Oster, and Williams, where they look at, or where they conclude that mother and child health care or healthcare centers or well child visits could potentially be explaining the difference between infant mortality rates between Europe and the US. So the US has a much higher infant mortality rate in the first year of life, but they also have a much lower access to infant health care. We also know from previous literature that having access to infant health care or that type of well-child visits has a short-term effect on infant mortality, both from a Danish program, but also from the Shepherd-Towner Act in the US. And there are 2 parallel papers that look at long-term effects of similar access programs on health outcomes, so adult health or longevity. The mother and child healthcare centers we study in this paper are opened by philanthropic by local initiatives and by philanthropic institutions. And the main institution providing these mother and child healthcare centers in Norway is the Norwegian Women's Public Health Association. That they organized about 90% of these mother and child healthcare centers, and we had access to their private archive where we digitalized all the records that are still available from these mother and child healthcare centers. Most of their centers were opened from 36 to 55, and they operated over 600 centers in 1960s. And in the early 1970s, the state actually mandated municipalities to have such a center, and started paying for these centers and made municipalities have one. The centers were targeted at poor families, but they were open to everyone. Visits were free. And they were, as I said earlier, targeted to seemingly healthy children. So they're called mother and child healthcare centers, but you should not imagine a tiny little hospital. What it mainly was a room that was rented by NKS or given to NKS in a church or in a school where they analyzed or where they measured babies and weighted babies and gave mothers advice about 6-7 times a year. So it's not a tiny little hospital, it's more like a service that came to visit the town and went away, but several times a year came back to town. The main goals were medical checkups by nurses and doctors, and ill infants were referred to hospitals, so there was no hospital-type care that could be provided by these centers. And the centers were also really important in giving mothers adequate advice on infant nutrition, infant hygiene, and adequate infant clothing. So a little bit more on these nutrition advices. So these centers were originally called in Norwegian milk kitchen. So they were really about food provision or the right provision of food. They heavily promoted breastfeeding, especially among poor women. So breastfeeding rates at that time in Norway were about 30%, so there was definitely room for improvement. And they also taught women how to do proper milk formulas. So at that time, a lot of milk formulas were diluted with unclean water and increased the risk of gastrointestinal diseases. So they tried to kind of show mothers how to make adequate formulas, what to use in formulas and what not. And some of the centers even supplied mothers with condensed milk, what was a product that became cheaply available during that time. The costs for these centers were covered by philanthropic contributions from the state lottery fund, and some of the finances also came from local governments, communities, and later the state. They paid doctors and nurses an annual salary and also reimbursed their travel expenses. But a substantial share, about half of their budget, actually went to printing material and information material for mothers. And the average cost for a whole year, so like 4 to 5 times that a kid would see a doctor in these centers, is about $22 in current US dollars. The data we use is Norwegian administrative data, and we follow the cohorts born from 1936 to 1960. And we can look at demographic and socioeconomic variables, but we also know their parental background and especially where they're born. So we know exactly where they're born and whether there was a center opened or not at that time. And we can also link 2 health surveys to this registered data that cover up to 80% of the cohorts. They're both measuring health at age 40, and they include not only survey data, but also actual medical measurements like height and weight and blood pressure and cholesterol risk or cardiac risk from blood tests and so on. And then we also have historical data that we collected that contains the opening dates and addresses of all these centers, and also the number of live births and the number of infants that died from different diseases per municipalities in the years we look at. look at these channels or potential mechanisms. Just to give you an idea about the rollout, so we are not going to consider the red dots or the red municipalities on that map. These are the centers that were opened very early, so some of them were opened in 1914. And we have very detailed data about these centers from 36 to 1960 or to about 1955, where we actually know how many kids visited these centers every year and so on, and what exactly they did with these kids. But we lack information on the first few years, and they mainly targeted the big cities like Oslo and Kristiansand. So what we're focusing on are the blue and the green areas. So the blue areas are the ones that get a center from 36 to 45, and the green areas are getting a center from 46 to 55. But we use the exact date of opening. Most of the specifications I will show you won't consider the white municipalities on this map. So we mostly only look at municipalities that actually received the center. And you should not be too worried about this area here that is mostly white. That's actually not, that's very scarcely populated. So most of the population lives around the coast, and that's also where most of the centers are located. What you see here is that so there were a few centers opened before 1936, so there were very few centers. But then in the late 1930s and in the early 1940s, there are a lot of centers opened. Then we have this little dip within 3 years. That's the end of the Second World War, where there were very few centers open. And then after the end of the Second World War, we have a large number of centers opened as well. The take-up rate was very fast, relatively high. So already in the first year after the opening, or in the year of the opening, so in the opening year, they covered about 40% of the kids born in each municipality, and the uptake increased to 60% in the third year of the opening, and very soon actually to 80%. So about 6 years after the opening, they covered up to 80% of the kids born. The research design we use is a generalized difference in difference model, where we exploit the timing of the newly established mother and child healthcare centers. That mainly means that we regress outcome Y of individual born in municipality C at time T on an indicator that is equal to 1 if an individual is born in or after the year of the center opening in a municipality of birth, and 0 otherwise. And we control, of course, for municipality fixed effects, cohort fixed effects, and a municipality-specific time trend, and a bunch of other individual-specific demographic variables and also municipality variables. Standard errors are clustered on municipality level, and we also have specifications where we include mother-specific fixed effects and other type of municipality-specific time trends. The biggest challenge is that we need to assume that the timing of the establishment is uncorrelated with other determinants of change in long-term economic outcomes. So to test this key identification assumption, what we do is we try to find out whether 1930 sociodemographic characteristics of municipalities or the change in these sociodemographic characteristics of municipalities between 1930 and 1940, whether this is predicting when such a center is opened. And what we find is that the population size and the number of doctors per population are contributing to the date when it's opened. But this effect is purely driven by Oslo and Bergen, so the two biggest cities. And these are some of the red dots that you've seen on my map, so we don't consider these municipalities. We're not looking at them in particular. So once we abstract from them, not the population size nor the doctors per inhabitants are driving the date when something is opened or when a center is opened. What is also important that we have no correlation with important determinants of children long-term outcomes, such as parents' education or parents' income, and there's also no correlation with the infant mortality rate prior to the introduction. So these are our main results. So the baseline results are using the variation in the blue and green municipalities on the map. Then we have a specification where we do not control for any individual specific characteristics or municipality specific characteristics. And the fourth row, so the all municipality row, also includes the white municipalities on the map. And what you see is that the effect is about 1 to 2% increase in years of education and about a 2 to 4% increase in earnings or lifetime earnings. And I need to point out that this is an intention to treat effect, and you've seen that our uptake is about 60 to 80%, so we would need to divide our effects by about 0.6 or 0.8 in order to get to the treatment on the treated effect. If we use mother-specific fixed effects, the estimate is slightly smaller. But it's also slightly smaller if we do an OLS on the mother or on the fixed effect sample, what tells us something that there is not just a smaller effect if we compare within siblings, but also that the sample of mothers that have at least 2 kids are maybe a little bit different from the sample of mothers that have only 1 kid in the cohort we considered. And I will come back to that later on again. So we do some heterogeneity tests where we look at whether men or women are affected differently. So men have a larger effect, but they're not significant, or the effects are not significantly different. But we find different effects by father's education level. So fathers that or kids of fathers that only have basic education, so no post-mandatory education, they actually benefit substantially more. They were also the main target group. And we also find that kids in places that have a lower medical standard in terms of, or lower health standard in the municipality, what we measure by tuberculosis infection rate, what is a big health threat at that time in Norway, we find that the kids in places with high TB rates are actually benefiting more. The effects are also bigger for kids in areas with high infant mortality rates, but they're not significantly larger. Then we do a long list of robustness tests. So we exclude World War II from our sample. We also control for a school reform that affects some of the last cohorts in our sample. We show that the results don't change if we use quadratic or cubic municipality-specific time trends. And what I'll show you next is that we also use an event study framework that allows for testing whether contemporaneous and lagged values do predict the outcome, but not lead variables. And I'll talk a little bit what might be a problem with infant mortality. So these are our event study framework figures. They show you that lead variables do not predict the outcome, but the contemporaneous effect plus all the lagged variables do. The reason why this might be highest is that first, the centers were targeted to poor families, and we know from the heterogeneous effects that these might have benefited more. Plus, it's an information treatment for most of it, and that might also spread through other channels than purely the health station. So that might contribute to this lowering of the effect over time. We find a very similar picture for earnings as well. Then we have this problem that we don't observe education and income of individuals that actually die before adulthood. So, so we might have scarring or selection. But what we find is that the mother and child healthcare centers have a positive effect on infant survival rate of roughly 1%. So what we do is that we estimate lower bounds for our education effect by dropping 1% of the treatment group. So we predict the educational distribution, and then we drop 1% at the 60th percentile, at the 70th, 80th, 90th, and even the top 1%, and the effects don't change. So let me talk a little bit about our mechanisms that we study. So we know that some of the centers provide slightly more healthcare than others, but we do not find a significant difference in the effect between these two types of centers. Then infant health might be affected because kids miss school less, or the human capital accumulation might be affected because kids miss school less due to poor health, but we do not find an effect there. So we know how many days of school are missed on municipality level, and we do not find an effect there. We also do not find a parental response to infant health. So we do not see fertility of mothers changing if they had an exposed child. And we do not find any spillovers on other siblings. So it's really purely something that mothers learn targeted to infants. But what we find is a support for lower infant mortality rates due to diarrhea and positive effect of access to mother and child healthcare centers on height and health at age 40. So that's the drop in the infant mortality rates due to diarrhea. We do not find any effect on pneumonia, on congenital malformations, TB or so. But what you can see is that relative to in the year of the opening of these centers, the numbers of kids dying from diarrhea drops dramatically. And we also find this substantial decrease in the index of metabolic bad health or metabolic health problems for both men and women. And we find that men and women are both about, or a little bit less than 2 centimeters higher when they had access to mother and child healthcare center, which kind of indicates that something changed in their nutrition during the first years of life, and that might have contributed to gain in height. So just to summarize, we find that these healthcare centers actually matter, so they have long-lasting effects. They're also cost-effective, so we computed the internal rate of return. It's about 7.7%. But the good thing about our study that we can study long-term effects is, on the other hand, also a drawback, and that's that this reform happened a long time ago, and that's not really clear how we can generalize to today's world, because today's health, at least in the developed world, the health situation of kids is dramatically different. But given that its likely mechanism is better nutrition if it's in the first year, so a lot of public health programs that provide better nutrition or information to mothers how to nourish babies can actually have long-lasting positive effects.
So thank you, Aline. We have time for a couple of quick questions, if there are any. Emma?
You had the outcome in school, you had this negative, significant dip in the 2 years before. Do you know where that was, and do you think that it's right
So we have that for education, and we don't know why it is, but it might contribute to like overestimating our effect a little bit. So that's definitely true. So we don't know why it's dipping, and we see no indication for why it should happen. But that's slightly worrisome that it's slightly below the 0 threshold. Yeah.
So I'm Teodora, I'm at UCL, and this is joint work with Christopher Rauh, who's at the University of Cambridge. So it has been established in the literature that skills accumulated throughout childhood are important determinants of later life outcomes, such as earnings or health. And at the same time, we know that educational investments that are made during the childhood period are very important for the skill acquisition of children. Now, interestingly, the literature has documented rather large differences in investments across socioeconomic groups. So we can see that parents with high socioeconomic status, they invest significantly more financial resources as well as time into their children, which might actually be surprising given the fact that high SES parents have less time available because they spend more time at work. So an interesting question is what drives parental investments and what could potentially explain these differences across socioeconomic groups. So one key explanation or one key factor that we're focusing on is the role of parental beliefs. So what do we mean by parental beliefs? We mean how do parents perceive the returns to the kinds of investments they make. We are building on the seminal work by Cunha et al., who to my knowledge were the first to use hypothetical investment scenarios to elicit parental beliefs about the returns to investments made in children who were very young. So he's looking at children who were 0 to 2 years old, and he's looking at a sample of low socioeconomic status mothers, and in that sample, he finds that the mothers seem to underestimate the returns to parental investments. Now, beyond this paper, very little is in fact known about what parents believe the production function to be. So we are going to ask the following 3 sets of questions. The first set of questions is, how do parents perceive the dynamic properties of the production function? So for those of you who are familiar with the human capital development literature, you will know that there's a lot of talking about when do parental investments or any kinds of investments matter more. Is it earlier? Is it later? So we want to know, how do parents perceive the relative returns to different kinds of investments in different time periods? Secondly, we want to know, do parents think that there are dynamic complementarities in the skill production function? So do they think that later investments are more productive when they're preceded by high early investments? Secondly, we want to document whether there is heterogeneity in perceived returns and whether this heterogeneity is systematic. So do high SES parents perceive the returns to be higher or not? And finally, there is this question in the room, well, what about perceived versus actual returns? This is, of course, a hard question to answer. It's actually a separate paper, but I'm going to briefly summarize the results of that as well. Now, this is my framework. It's very simple. So just imagine there's a child who has these initial skills, theta 1, and then there are 2 time periods during which parents can invest, I1 and I2, and then there's this later life outcome, Y. Just think of these 2 time periods broadly as the primary school period and the secondary school period. So we are not going to look at very early childhood periods as in Cunha et al. Now, we are interested in different things. So just imagine that these 3 different inputs map into this later life outcome. What you might be interested in is how parents perceive the marginal returns to investments in any given time period. And you could also be interested in how they perceive the complementarity between these 2 different inputs, or between any of these 2 different inputs. So for example, here we could ask the question, do parents think that later investments are more productive if they're preceded by high early investments? Or here, do they think that investments are more productive if the initial skill level of the child is high? Now, how are we going to answer these questions? We're going to collect survey data, and we're going to present parents with hypothetical investment scenarios that differ along 3 key dimensions. The first dimension is the initial human capital level of the child. The second one is the level of early investments. And the third one is the level of late investments. For each of these, we're going to have a low level and a high level. So altogether, it's basically a 2 by 2 by 2. So every parent sees 8 different scenarios and is asked to state what he or she believes the likely earnings of the child in this scenario to be at age 30. So here's just an overview of the different scenarios. So you have 2 families, one with a child of low initial human capital, one with a child of high initial human capital. And for each of these 2 different families that are described as otherwise identical, you see 2 different low levels, 2 different levels of early investments and 2 different levels of late investments. So you see all these possible combinations. So let me just give you an example. So for example, it could say, Mr. and Mrs. Jones have 1 child, John, and John is in year 3 of primary school. And in the key stage 1 sets, John achieved the expected level. So these are standardized tests that all children in the UK have to sit. In the following school years, Mr. and Mrs. Jones can decide how much to help John with his schoolwork. And assuming there is no inflation, what do you expect John's gross yearly earnings to be if they help John with his schoolwork? And then you kind of see these different kinds of investments. So here you see 1 hour every week in school years 3 to 6. So that is a low level of early investment here. And 1 hour every week in school years 7 to 10. Again, this is the low level. And then we kind of vary these numbers. Yeah, so you might see 4 hours and 1 hour, or like 1 hour and 4 hours, and then like finally 4 hours and 4 hours. Yeah, so you kind of vary the different kinds of the levels of investments and then ask about the likely outcomes. Right, so just to summarize, in sample A, for the initial human capital level of the child, low means that the child did not achieve the expected level in year 2, whereas high means that the child did achieve the expected level in year 2. Then early investments refer to investments made in school years 3 to 6, where low is 1 hour every week and high is 4 hours every week. And then we have similar thing for late investments, only that these refer to school years 7 to 10. Now, we did this study, and then people told us that maybe we could also try with different kinds of investments instead of this one very specific type of investment that we chose. So we did a separate data collection in sample B, where we have exactly the same setup, only that we now have different kinds of investments. So in sample B, we somewhat differently defined low and high levels of initial human capital. And now for early investments and late investments, what we did was we looked at the British cohort study data and we looked at what kind of investment questions were actually being asked at age 5 and at age 10. And we took these specific types of investments and used them in our survey. This has two advantages. First, we're not making random investments up. We're looking at what these people who designed the survey thought was relevant at these ages. And also, it later helps us to compare the estimates from the British cohort study data to our beliefs data. So you can read here what early and late investments refer to. So, for example, early investments are things like reading to your child, going to the playground, or letting your child watch TV. That's a negative investment, by the way. And then late investments are things like showing interest in your child's education, talking to your child, or engaging your child with your child in activities together. Now you can see that, like here in brackets, it says -half and +half is standard deviation. So basically, this is taking the numbers from the real data. So low levels of investments are constructed here in a way that in the British cohort study data, this is like -half a standard deviation from the mean. Now, this is the empirical specification. We're going to regress log earnings as reported by the parent in scenario J on the level of early investments, the level of late investments, the human capital level of the child, and these three interaction terms. So what this is going to give us, it's going to give us measures of the perceived returns to early and late investments, and also of the perceived complementarity and substitutability between these two, each of these two different inputs. Now, we collected this data via 2 surveys that we distributed via parental mailing lists of schools. In total, we have about 2,000 parents who completed, or actually a bit more, 2,500 parents who completed the survey. Let me just jump straight into results. So in the top panel, you see the results in sample A, and in the bottom panel, you see the results in sample B. And in each of these 2 rows, there are 8 bars each, corresponding to each of the 8 different scenarios. So for example, just focusing at the top panel for sample A for a second. So these are the 4 scenarios in which the human capital level of the child was high initially. And this bar tells you what all parents on average believed how much this child is going to make at age 30 if investments in the early period were low and investments in the late period were low. In that case, parents think that on average, this child is going to make about 22K. Now, moving to the other extreme, where both investment levels are high, so high early investments and high late investments, this bar is higher as you would expect, and this is about 37K. Now, these 2 bars in the middle are the 2 interesting ones I find. These basically give you, so one of them is high and the other one is low. So what is this saying? Interestingly, this bar is lower than that bar. This bar means that there were high early investments and low late investments, whereas this bar says that there were high late investments and low early investments. Does everybody see that? So it's basically saying that if you invest a lot early and a little late, your child's going to make less, or that's at least what parents think, than if you do it the other way around. This was contrary to what we might have expected, because at least my reading from the literature initially was that early investments might matter more than late investments, but at least in our data, this does not seem to be what parents perceive. We find the same if you have low initial human capital, and we find the same results for sample B. Now, of course, a good question is always, what do people actually make on average when they're 30? This is the actual average from the real data. So at least on average, our parents are pretty well in predicting what people make. So these are just the regression results. So regressing perceived log earnings at age 30 in scenario J on these different characteristics of the scenarios, first for sample A and then for sample B. So the way to interpret these numbers is that 1 additional hour of weekly time investments in this early time period leads to a 5.1% increase in earnings. That's how it's perceived to be. For late, the number is 8.5%, and these two coefficients are significantly different from each other at the 1% level. So parents do seem to perceive the returns to these late time investments to be higher. Similarly, in sample B, here the interpretation of the coefficients is a bit different because we have different kinds of investments. So the way to read this is that a 1 standard deviation increase in these kinds of early investments that we gave them increases earnings by 10%, whereas a 1 standard deviation increase in these late investments increases earnings by about 31.5%. Again, these two coefficients are significantly different from each other. Maybe not surprisingly, if you already have a smart kid to start out with, you also think that the kid's going to do better. Now, what happens if you plug in these interaction terms? I would just like to draw your attention to these two coefficients here. They are significantly negative. So if you interact early and late investments, you get a significantly negative coefficient. This means that parents perceive the returns to later time investments to be lower if they're preceded by high early investments. Again, something that is contrary to what I might have expected to find, given the literature that kind of seems to suggest that there might be dynamic complementarities in the skill accumulation process. Now, for each respondent, we can now calculate the perceived return to higher initial human capital, to higher early investments, and to higher late investments. So previously, we were just pulling everyone together. Now we can actually look at individual perceived returns. So this is just showing you some scatter plots or like some contour plots of where our data is. So here, for example, just focusing on this one. So if you're on top of this 45-degree line, then that means that you perceive later investments as more productive than early investments. And you can see that for most parents this is the case, but there are also some parents who do think that early investments are more productive than late investments. But I think the main takeaway from this graph really is that there is a lot of heterogeneity, both in the levels as well as in the perceived relative returns of these two types of investments. This is a plot that shows you the difference in mean beliefs between the top income quartile and the bottom income quartile. What you can see here is that people who are rich are more likely to think that these initial skills matter more, and they're also more likely to believe that early investments into children matter more relative to low-income parents. We do not find any significant difference for the parental beliefs to these later kinds of investments. And I think it's rather remarkable that we find strikingly similar results across the two samples. These are completely different parents. They have not seen the previous questionnaire, and yet we find very similar results. So there do seem to be systematic differences across socioeconomic groups, and I think this is kind of interesting because this might be a potential reason why we also see these systematic differences in actual investment levels. Now, just to summarize the main results so far, some parents perceive later investments as more productive than early investments. They do seem to perceive investments in different time periods as substitutes rather than complements, and we have these socioeconomic differences in perceived returns, especially to early investments. Now, we did a whole bunch of other additional analyses that I'm not going to show you in detail, but just to summarize, we played around with the outcome variable. What if we use probability of university attendance instead? We find the same results. We did correlate elicited beliefs with self-reported levels of investments, and as you would expect, you find a positive correlation. We also randomized order of survey modules and things like that to show that the results are robust to these things. Something that's quite interesting is we also find evidence for perceived diminishing returns. So something that we did was we actually randomized parents into two different groups. So some people saw 1 hour and 4 hours as low and high levels, whereas other people saw 0 hours and 3 hours. And exactly as we expected, we found that the group who saw 0 and 3 hours perceived the returns to be higher, kind of consistent with parents perceiving the returns to parental investments to be diminishing. We also randomized gender of the child in the scenario. Here the main finding was that while parents think that girls are going to earn less than boys at age 30, there was no significant difference in the perceived return to investment across genders. Finally, we also correlated beliefs with the perceptions of parents about the malleability of skills or the capabilities to acquire children, the capabilities of children to acquire skills in general. So what this means is basically that parents who report that they think their children's skills, that's not something that they as parents can really affect. They are also the ones who perceive the returns to be lower. It's just really a different way of measuring this in a different survey. And also in this last one, we also found significant differences. So parents of low socioeconomic status, they're more likely to agree with statements like, my child develops at his or her own pace, and I as a parent can't do anything about it. Now, why do I think this is interesting? I think this actually raises the question whether there might be potential interventions that we could do in the home environment to try to engage parents more. So, for example, you could think of interventions that emphasize the importance of investments in the skill accumulation process, or that convey this idea that skills are malleable and can be affected by investments. And in fact, in a different paper with Schule, Aline, and Seda Ertach, we can show that that it is possible to do such an intervention in the school environment. So we actually did an intervention where we targeted students' beliefs about the productivity of effort in the skill accumulation process. And we can see that children, as a result, they put in more effort and they also accumulate more skills, and they also score significantly higher in standardized achievement tests. So given that there are such successful interventions in the school environment, one question we could think about is whether we could do something similar with parents. Now, of course, the question that's kind of in the room is, well, are these parental beliefs correct or not? And I think there are two main questions here. The first one is this thing about the timing. What is more important? Is it really earlier, or maybe we don't really know? I think actually the literature has produced rather mixed results, and more work is needed for us to really understand what kind of investments are productive when, and what the relative returns to investments in different time periods are. Another question, which I think is a bit under-researched actually, but I find there's surprisingly little evidence on whether the returns to different kinds of investments differ by socioeconomic status, because it could, of course, in fact, be that low SES parents do not just think that the returns are lower, but that for them the returns really are lower. What we did in a complementary paper was we estimated a human capital production function using data from the British cohort study. And these are just the two main takeaways from the paper. The first one is that parents do seem to be on average correct about the returns to early investments, but they seem to highly overestimate the returns to late investments, in fact, by a factor of 2. So they do seem to overall overestimate the importance of late investments relative to early investments. When we separately estimate the production function for low and high SES parents, we in fact can't reject the null that the productivity parameters are the same in both specifications. So it does seem to be that the estimated returns to parental time investments are independent of parents' socioeconomic status. So just in general, I think this is a very little is known about these things, and we need more work to fully understand what the actual production functions look like. Thank you.
Thank you. So we have time for a question.
Okay, well, I've got a lot of interesting questions, but one of the main ones...
I think this need to
Ian Enby from Lancaster. A lot of interesting questions come out of that, absolutely fascinating.
Thank you.
One of the main ones is your negative complementarity finding. Well, we also found that there's this diminishing returns belief, which could be an artifact of preference and belief anchoring, in so much as if I think they're going to earn about this, I might not be sufficiently adapting given the new information, i.e. not Bayesian updating. Anyway, you could use the data that you've got on the magnitude of the diminishing returns to offset the fact that there's now 2 inputs in the complementarity.
Yeah, I can see
Does that
what
make
you're
sense?
saying.
To see whether actually we're finding negative complementarity beliefs, or whether actually we're just finding an artifact of the diminishing returns.
Of there just being more and the diminishing
Yes.
returns. That's a good point.
I
Yes,
thought.
thank you. Yeah.
I'll take one more.
I don't know if you're aware of the literature on college competition of Rami and Rami. It's so this paper of Rami and Rami poses that because of competition for college admissions, parents, high educated parents are going to invest more because they are going to be more productive. And I think you've spoken about productivity and differences in productivities at the end of your talk.
Thank you. Yeah,
But
I'll have a look at it.
that same result is also possible if you consider potential complementarities between time and money.
Yes.
We have a paper with data in the UK. I'm sorry, I'm Cristina Borra from the University of Seville. I have a joint paper with Almudena Sevilla from Queen Mary, and we are investigating exactly as an origin for the different parental investments in children because of education, if these complementarities with time and money could be the answer. So in addition to having these beliefs,
so,
if it's also something about money.
Yes, so thank you very much for the comment.
Thank
So first, please do send me the paper. The second thing I would like to say is that, in fact, just 2 months ago, we collected a new data set which is representative of parents in the UK. And this time, we actually varied 3 different types of investments. So we varied school quality, we varied time investments, and also financial investments made by the parents and the children. And we want to see how parents perceive the kind of complementarity or substitutability between these 3 different types of inputs. So I'd be very curious to see your work and see how our results compare to what you find.
So now we have come to the last paper, and this paper is together with Aline, who is here, and a PhD student at Norwegian School of Economics, Antonio Dalla Suena, and myself. So in this paper, we are sort of going a bit further again. So now we are looking at intergenerational links between parents and children, actually in 3 generations. So what we are particularly interested in this paper is whether an economic shock can break the link between parents and children, and to what extent it can do it, and what type of form it can do it. So we know already that there are papers showing changes in intergenerational mobility over time. So clearly something is changing over time, and particularly I don't know how many papers Kjell and co-authors has on differences in intergenerational mobility depending on region. So there are clearly big differences in regional mobility within one country. And so in a way, what the question we are asking in this paper, is there something, an economic shock that can break that link, and what type of form it has? Because we don't really know very much about that. There is a little bit of information about that, and I wish come back to that, but there is not very much. So in particular, what we're asking here is that how is intergenerational mobility affected by big economic shock? And what is driving the effects? What type of mechanisms do we have? And how persistent are the the change in intergenerational mobility stemming from that shock? So we will look at not only 2 generations, but with 3 generations. So what we're going to do, we're going to look at a particular type of shock, and that is important because you will see the mechanism will be different, I think, from other types of shock. So what we will be doing is that we will exploit the timing and location of oil shock in Norway, or oil discovery in Norway. So we will look at changes in intergenerational mobility prior, 2 generations before the shock happened, then the generation that was hit, actually the child generation that was hit, and the intergenerational mobility between the parents to them, and then follow the kids of those kids again. And we will look at both in earnings and in as a mechanism then in education. So what do we find? We do find actually that intergenerational mobility is changed when you have an economic shock of this type. We do not find that it is, we do find that it is a little bit persistent to the next generation again, but you change the mobility and then it seems to be quite persistent, at least for the next generation again. So this is a particular type of shock. I mean, this is an oil shock, and an oil shock means that there's a high demand for low-skilled workers, at least in the beginning. So the mechanism here will not be, increased investment in human capital. It will actually be the opposite, since that is a particular type of shock. So we actually see less investment in education, and that seems to also persist to the next generation again. Some of the literature, I already mentioned it. There are papers showing that there are changes in intergenerational mobility over time. For instance, in the Nordic countries, there's a couple of papers. There are some nice papers by Martin Nyboom and Jan Stoler on the same topic, and also earlier papers. And we have these papers showing that there are big differences in intergenerational mobility within one country, for instance, in the US. And also the Kjell paper is using Italian data showing sort of something similar. There is one paper that has something of the same flavor as ours. A PhD student at Harvard 1 or 2 years ago, Feigenbaum, he is using the Iowa census from 1918, I think, and 1939, showing the differential effect of the Great Depression across regional labor markets in Iowa. And he finds that, those regions shocked most by hit most by the Great Depression, they see a reduction in intergenerational mobility. So it's actually the kids from the richest parents that is benefiting from that. That is sort of exactly the same result as we find, but we have a positive shock. So what are we doing? Okay, so this is a little bit about literature showing the connection between a resource boom and education, basically, where when you have a resource boom, meaning that you can get a good job without investing in human capital. So that is well known. In the Norwegian case, there has been some papers showing that the effect of the oil sector has been, that there is a big increase in the demand for those occupations. So that is sort of what we are building on here. So we are thinking about this as a demand shock for a particular type of workers. So this is a very brief history of economic history since the 1960s. Very brief, one slide. So basically the oil was, they started to explore in the early mid-60s basically, and then oil was discovered in the late 60s. And then they started to produce in the early 70s. And this is the area where the oil fields are, and the Stavanger region, the west coast, is the main region for, the main labor market for oil production, and also sort of the support industry for that sector. Importantly is that in the early 70s, the Norwegian government decided that the oil industry should be developed, or the oil sector should be developed in Norway. there should not only be, foreign companies exploring, but they should build and even in the beginning protect new oil industry. That was essential for the policy, and it's also essentially for us because you will see in the 70s that is when the oil sector expanded in some regions and not in others. So that is the type of development we are using. So the data, remember now that the data we are using is the main cohorts, is the birth cohorts between 52 and 57 that is entering the labor market in the early 70s, when the oil sector was developed. So remember that differently from other papers on intergenerational mobility, for instance, several papers on intergenerational mobility in education, we are shocking the child cohorts, not the parental cohorts, at least in the beginning. So this will be our child cohorts, the 52 to 57 entering the labor market sort of after their education decisions. So that is already done, and then they are starting to, in the labor market. So that would be the main one. And then we have information on the parents of these guys. And then so that would be the intergenerational link that we are mainly analyzing. And then we have a cohort with parents, fathers and sons before that. And that would be the sons born in 32 to 33. And these guys will be in their 40s when the oil was found. So they have already established themselves in the labor market. So why 32, 33? The reason is that that is the earliest cohorts that we have good data on, also for the parents. There's a long story behind that, but somebody digitalized those and connected it to the census of 1960, which is the basis for the registry data in Norway. They did it in the 50s, so we have that data in particular. And then what we are doing next is that we are also looking at the kids or the sons of these guys, sort of as the third generation. We have a lot of demographic variables, so and so, and we assign each individual to the region where they were born, not necessarily where they are living, sort of like having that as an instrument for that. And we also, to some extent, to avoid selection into migration. We are also looking particularly at migration. If I have time, I will, which I maybe not have, I will show you that. So, long story about data. So we can measure income from 67. It means that for most of these sons and fathers, we can measure income when they are in their 30s, 40s, and early 50s. For one cohort, that is the fathers of those born in 32 to 33, we are imputing data based on municipalities and occupations in 1948 from tax data, but that is not individual level data. So we have tested also different ways of measuring this, and with in a companion paper, a lot of the robustness of that. So there's always a big issue when to measure income in this intergenerational mobility literature. So, but fortunately, there has been some recent development. So we are using rank correlations, and also a nice paper by Jan Stoler and Martin Nienbaum showing that rank regressions they are much more they're much more stable to when you are measuring income than, let's say, log income type of approach. So what we are doing is that we are using the regions with high oil versus low oil regions, and the more oil industries there are, the redder are the areas, and you can see that this is mostly in the coastal areas. And the Stavanger region area, there's a lot of oil industry. Note that this is not only people working on the fields, This is also people, producing equipment. I mean, most of the people in these industries are producing equipment for the industry, which is a big, pipelines and whatever they're doing. And we are splitting into high and low oil regions. So the mean percentage of employment in the high oil regions, the mean is like 17% in those regions, and the mean in these regions is, 5-6%. So these are the cutoffs we are doing. Well, you see that there are some other places also, but that has to do with that in some of these areas they already had industries producing sort of that type of technology, but for other purposes earlier. I'm not going into that. Quickly on the measures we are using. As I said, we are using a standard measure of relative mobility. So something is happening in terms of intergeneration mobility, but it could be at the top or it could be at the end. You cannot really say. And we are looking at regional differences, as I said. So, but we are using the ranking people in the national distribution. So we're using the rank of the fathers and the rank of the sons, and it's the rank in the national distribution. We are also looking at absolute mobility, basically looking at the transition matrix, showing the probability of a son to be in a particular quantile of their earnings distribution nationally, given a particular place they come from, where the father was. So this will sort of make it easier for us to look at where the mobility is happening, not only that there is a change in mobility. Yeah, I already said that, I think. So this is our main cohort then, the child cohort that was sort of shocked by this oil shock. And this is just the descriptive statistics, non-parametrically showing the distribution. So this is the father's rank, and this is the mean rank of the sons. And this is the low oil regions, and this is the high oil regions. Well, as you see in many countries, there are non-linearities. Something sort of like a trap at the bottom, and something special at the top. You always, for most countries at least, you will see that. The interesting thing for us here is that for the high oil regions, there's a much higher probability for most, up to 80%, for the sons to be in a higher rank than their fathers, than as compared to the control region of low oil. So this is for the connection between these guys and their fathers. And if you look at the pre-period, basically, in a different setups, the pre-period, and using the same definitions of high and low regions as before, but now for cohorts born in 32, 33, you see there's no difference. So clearly something has happened in this period, increasing the social mobility in income. Nothing before, and you see after, something definitely has happened. And if you do this in a regression framework, you see that there is, for this cohort then, there's no difference growing up in, or being born in a high and low oil region, being born in 32, so this is the rank correlation between these sons and their fathers. There's no, I mean, the interaction term is significantly not different from 0. So, and here you see there is a reduction in persistence for this generation, and it actually also goes on for later cohorts. And if you look at the transition matrix, I will only show you a couple of things. So, looking at where the changes is happening, not only that there is a change. So this is this is in the low oil region for the our treatment group. We see that if the fathers are in the first the poorest, the first quintile, there's a high probability of staying in that for the sons, for the low oil. And there is a probability for being in the fifth, but compared to the high oil, we see that there's a much higher probability for staying in the low oil, if the fathers were in the first, and also for the sons, and a higher probability for moving even to the top. And you see it also here. So definitely it is a change at the bottom, we see. Because if you are comparing, being at the highest percentile, so these columns are very similar, both in high and low oil. And if we are doing the same thing for those born in the 1930s, we will see that there is much less difference. Yeah, so I'm not going through it, but just showing. So what could be the mechanism for this? So what is interesting, so what we have found now is that there is an increase in economic mobility, from the bottom to the top when you have a shock. So the first part of the story is that an economic shock can break the link, which is interesting. So, but of course this is a very particular type of shock. So usually you would think that when you have an increase in social mobility, it means that, parents invest more in human capital, for instance. And that is the, new industries which requires more human capital, and the parents see that and they invest. So, but this shock is a different type of shock than sort of, let's say, new high-tech industries are entering the scene. This is a resource boom. So what you see here is that, in fact, there is a change in investment in human capital, but the other way around. So there's less investment. What that is, I don't know. So there's less investment in academic high school. For the high oil. And there is more investment in vocational training in the high oil than in the low oil. So, and that is also what you see when you look at association between sons' probability of attending academic high school and father's percentile rank in income. So no difference in 32-33, and there is actually not so much going on here either in terms of education. And if anything, we will see that returns to academic education, academic high school and up, there is a reduction in the high oil regions, as we can see from this interaction term. So this is the main story of the paper. Indeed, a shock does break the links, but this is a particular type of shock, so there is less investment in human capital. And this seems to be also persistent to the next generation again. So this is the sons of those born in 52-33. This is the low oil regions. So these, this is our fathers, this is our first generation in a way, so those born in 52-57. So these are the guys that came from a low rank of these guys. And then you see the sons of these guys again on the y-axis, the probability of attending academic high school. So we see in the low oil, there is a tendency that even these guys, there's a higher probability of that their sons again are investing in more human capital. Not so for the high oil regions. So these guys came from a low parental background. They did very well during the boom in terms of income, but you see their sons again. They're sort of persistent, not investing in human capital. So this is the main story. Indeed, a shock does break the link, but this particular type of shock leads to less investment in human capital. And that's it. No questions. I can take a question, but you know.